Religious horror is a subgenre whose common themes are based on religion and heavily focus on supernatural beings, often with demons or some form of the devil as the main antagonist. Within this subgenre, religious elements such as crucifixes, the Bible, as well as the church itself are commonly included. And this focus on predominantly Christian mythology has touched nearly every aspect of contemporary religious horror media today. Much of that is due to the overwhelming influence of Christianity throughout much of the Western world, especially the United States. And while this subgenre is definitely oversaturated, that's not to say there aren't legitimately interesting stories still being told. Despite its use of AI images, I was quite entertained with the Australian film Late Night with the Devil, yet very disappointed in Oz Perkins' Longlegs, but still am eagerly awaiting A24's Heretic. As with any genre though, quality ranges, and it's usually about how well a certain film can subvert the genre's tropes, as well as the audience's expectations to really stand out amongst a sea of overcrowded slop being constantly thrown our way. Which is why today we're talking about one of the best, and certainly one of my favorite recent additions to the religious horror genre, Dylan Clark's short horror film, Portrait of God, which you can watch right here on YouTube absolutely free. Seriously, if you haven't seen this, pause the video, watch it, and then come back, because there will be spoilers and you'd be doing yourself a disservice by watching this first. But before I jump into what makes Portrait of God so refreshing, we're gonna need some context. Let's go back to the 1970s. See, the 1960s had been a time of great social change in the United States. It didn't come easy as political violence, racial tensions, and high-profile assassinations were at an all-time high. Nonetheless, Americans were finally challenging some fundamental beliefs of what it meant to be American. Which brings us to 1971, when another major core aspect of the previous American identity was going to be challenged in a way that would horrify a new generation.
Welcome back to the program. My next guest is an author of the, perhaps best known as the author of The Exorcist. Please welcome now William Peter Blatty.
On May 5th, 1971, after 10 months of writing, the devout Catholic, novelist, and screenwriter William Peter Blatty would release his magnum opus novel, The Exorcist, onto the world. The novel detailing the demonic possession of 11-year-old Reagan McNeil was a success and would stay on the New York Times bestseller list for 54 weeks. Given the book's popularity, a highly successful movie adaptation of the same name, also written and produced by Blatty, would release just 2 years later, and oh boy, did this movie turn heads.
On December 26, 1973, in 24 selected engagements in the United States, William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin, opened. From the novel that had long been on the bestseller lists and directed by the man who had brought the French Connection to the screen, The Exorcist had long been awaited, widely speculated upon, and anxiously anticipated. But no one, no matter how close or deeply involved in the film, could possibly have anticipated what was to happen at every theater where this film played.
The Exorcist was a cultural phenomenon. It grossed $193 million in 1973. To put that in perspective, when adjusting for inflation, that would be over $1.3 billion today and would land it in the 22nd spot of highest grossing films of all time. In garnering the tagline, "The Scariest Movie Ever," the film that Blatty wrote, which was directed by William Friedkin, would set the bar for all religious horror going forward. And they did it while not even seeing The Exorcist as a horror film at all. In his memoir, Friedkin says, "We both shared the notion that The Exorcist was not going to be a horror film or a send-up, but was going to be a film about the mystery of faith and the existence of good and evil in everyone. We never talked about this horror effect or that one." And Blatty himself agreed, saying, "Several years ago, I set out to write a novel that would not only excite and entertain, sermons that put one to sleep are useless, but would also make a positive statement about God, the human condition, and the relationship between the two. On its crudest level, it would argue for transcendence by presenting supernatural forces as real, but on the level that would stay with the reader long after he had closed the book. The theme was something other and deeper." It's obvious that for these two men, The Exorcist was way more than just a horror flick. It's both a novel and film that explores the mystery of faith by challenging it through a horrific demonic possession. In a way, The Exorcist has much more to say about faith when faced with evil than something like God's Not Dead, because instead of role-playing the victim and addressing the audience as self-righteous, holier-than-thou, God-fearing Christians who can do no wrong, The Exorcist respects its audience and questions religion in, yes, a more abstract, but also more authentic way. The Exorcist shows us that the existence of good and evil is within us all, and that evil can seep in through the seams if we're not careful, because it's an inherent part of the human condition. And of course, this isn't to say that The Exorcist isn't horror, because it absolutely is. Even Friedkin himself would agree with this.
And I don't call this a horror film. I hope you do.
No, it is a horror film.
All right, you want to call it a horror film?
But the thing that made The Exorcist so special, and what's often missing from contemporary religious horror films today, is it fundamentally challenged the church, and thus the American identity as a whole. See, many religious horror films today attempt to be provocative or scary without saying anything at all about religion itself, and most definitely don't do anything to make us feel uncomfortable within our own cultural identity. It's all scares with no substance. The Exorcist deeply unnerved so many people because it was the first time in America that the idea that faith in God in of itself might not be enough, and that terrified people. It showed people that letting in God also means letting in the devil, because you ultimately cannot have one without the other. Were the effects scary for their time? Sure, and so are the current effects we see in movies today. But many were left with nightmares due to The Exorcist because the last bastion of the old American identity was no longer safe. Salvation could no longer be guaranteed by the church because the devil was already there, and he was in our homes perverting the youth and the innocent and working through the clergy, and the devil was gonna get his due regardless. Which brings me to The Portrait of God. So I've done a lot to build up this short horror film from 2 years ago as if it's some modern day epic horror classic with the same je ne sais quoi and lasting impact as The Exorcist. And if I'm being real, that likely isn't true. But that doesn't mean what Dylan Clark has created here isn't damn good. The Portrait of God opens with a quote from Exodus 33:20. "No man shall see me and live." While starting a horror film off by quoting religious texts is a mainstay of the genre, it does a good job of setting the tone quickly with some added foreshadowing. Remember, this is a short film with a runtime just under 7 minutes. We can forgive this sin. Continuing on, we're then brought along through what I think is best described as a religious experience with our surrogate Mia as she's rehearsing through a presentation on a photograph of a supposed painting of God. The twist in all this is the painting appears black with no discernible image at all, yet still many have recounted their experience with this painting with consistent descriptions of a figure ranging from beautiful to frightening. And we're left with the question,
why does God appear to them and not us?
And this is why I said we needed all that context in the beginning, because remember when I said, but the thing that made The Exorcist so special, and what's often missing from contemporary religious horror films today, is it fundamentally challenged the church. Well, if The Exorcist challenged the church, then The Portrait of God goes one step further and challenges God himself. And it does it in a way that speaks so well to the religious temperament of our day. Americans have become less religious over time, and perhaps we've taken fear God to its logical conclusion here. A being so powerful, omniscient, and quite frankly, absolutely overwhelming would be a transcendent experience in the case of an encounter. It would be confusing, but I think what makes this especially frightening is how would, if you even could, tell if a being that wielded that much power is good or evil. I think it's a natural response to fear that kind of being, and yet it feels oddly attractive, as if I'm under the same trance as Mia. It's truly a religious experience, one that questions God and terrifies because the vast uneasiness it stirs within me. Like Blatty's remarks regarding The Exorcist, I think The Portrait of God is something other and deeper, but this time without any positive statement of God or salvation at the end, and I think that's what terrifies me the most. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a happy Halloween, and let me know what scares you down below. Peace.